This is the Tree of Life, Season 16, Chapter 4. In this episode, we will be talking about how analog structures have an affinity to aggregate affirmational phases amongst parallel digital structures. To start out, let's return to the example of the club, where you decided to ask a woman her name on the other side of the dance floor. Your friend intervenes and attempts to suggest that you allow them to buy you a drink. In that case, a substitutionary relationship was formed as between Impulse 1 and Impulse 2, where Impulse 1 is going with the friend for the drink and Impulse 2 is asking the woman's name. That is to say, your friend affirms Impulse 1 and negates Impulse 2. In this case, there is a parallel digital structure in a negational phase, corresponding to Impulse 2 and its dialectical opposite by class. That is to say that these two structures can coexist so long as the digital structure is in the negational phase, corresponding to negation of Impulse 2 and affirmation of its dialectical opposite. Now, what we further see is that substitutionary analog structures form as between two impulses based upon the valence of the parallel digital structures. Which is to say, that digital structures form in a series as between two people reflective of the relative affirmation or negation of those parallel structures. This means, for example, that the substitutionary relationship corresponding to the analog structure forms due to misalignment of the parallel digital structure as between that third person. Let me explain what I mean. Imagine for a moment that Impulse 2, namely the impulse to walk to the other side of the dance floor and ask the girl's name, is not met with affirmation, but negation, as in the last episode, assuming you had not been met by the intervening friend. That would reflect the arrangement of the analog and parallel digital structure in the last episode. Now, from this occurrence, we can imagine some embarrassment and discomfort on your part. In other words, the intervention of your friend reflected a more beneficial outcome, assuming that you go along with them. This is consistent with how we observed that negation within an analog structure generates a causal reordering through sublimation in the resumption of time parsimony with the transformation of that structure into a digital one. Thus, we must imagine that the parallel digital structure, which describes negation of Impulse 2, retrospectively reflects this causal reordering by consequence of its negation within the parallel analog structure. In other words, the parallel digital structure is the end stage of a period of infinite recursion, which revealed manifold analog structures and observed the transformation of those structures into their digital counterparts. Likewise, we can say that the substitutionary valence of a parallel structure is the measure of its affirmation within those sequential descending increasingly convoluted paths. This valence reflects the ultimate affirmation or negation of those constituent structures during infinite recursion before the causal reordering. All of the information thus represented by these convoluted paths is represented within the originating analog structure, which diverts you away from the girl on the other side of the dance floor. In other words, analog structures seem to form in parallel to digital structures by incorporation of all of the information represented by infinite recursion into the substitutionary impulse. So, for example, perhaps the girl on the other side of the dance floor would have engaged in conversation with you. Perhaps it would have led to a relationship. Perhaps it would have led to heartbreak and tragedy. It is as if your friend's intervention is not some innocent act of a friend attempting to buy you a drink, but blindly acting on foreknowledge of the difficulties you would endure if you ask her name. And all of that information is present within the structure due to infinite recursion, which happens in the midst of negation and a substitution event. Thus, we can say that the substitutionary valence is a reflection of all of the infinite structures created through infinite recursion encapsulated within the parallel digital structure which results. This information is by virtue of the linking of conformational states with the analog structure describing substitutionary impulses 1 and 2 also present within that structure as well. That's the end of the podcast for today.